Perfect. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our September First Friday webinar. We're very excited to have Dr. Janie Sacco presenting on supporting student activism. Janie couldn't be with us for the beginning of this morning's webinar, but she graciously used her time earlier in the week to record the webinar with me, which I will be playing, and then Janie will be joining us later to answer questions. So make sure you're saving your questions for her, as she will be hopping on closer to the end of the recording. Before I get that started, though, I do have a couple of reminders for the room. At the end of the session, I'll be posting a link to our evaluation form, which we would love if you filled out to give us feedback on these presentations and webinars. Also, if you're interested in presenting a webinar of your own, we are very open to having new presenters for our First Friday webinar series. So please feel free to email me or Becca, the other co-chair, at prodev@northwestcuho.org. I'll also be posting that email address in the chat later on, closer to the end of the session. Otherwise, keep yourselves muted throughout the entirety of the presentation, and then feel free to ask questions through microphones or through the chat later on once Janie hops on. But without further ado, I'm gonna press play on this. If people can't hear it, please let me know though as well. Anyway, without further ado, I'll start the presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to be presenting with you. My name is Dr. Janie Sacco, and I am an Associate Director over at St. Martin's University. I also teach in the Gender and Identity Studies program there. So this morning, I'm going to talk to you all about supporting student activism and what it means to incorporate activism in our role as diversity educators. In these current times, and even in the past few years, I've seen a shift to incorporating more diversity education into our work with resident assistants and into residential curriculum models. While this diversity work increase has been awesome, I've noticed that's focused a lot on education spaces, and by that I mean teaching students about concepts, topics, and theories. And areas where I think it could grow definitely include creating affinity spaces, so creating those safer spaces for students with shared identities, and action spaces, so teaching students about activism and what that might look like for them. And so today what I'm going to do is focus on what I like to call action spaces and talking a little bit more about activism. Next slide, please. All right, so I'd like us to get started with a brief reflection. I know this is a bit odd to do on a recorded call, but we're going to go ahead and take a moment. I want you all to think about the following questions and really do an inventory as we begin this presentation. My hope is that by reflecting on these questions, that you'll be able to see throughout the presentation areas where you might be able to enhance what your department does or how that might work for your institution. So I'm going to give you all 1 minute to reflect on these questions, and I'm going to go ahead and read those questions out loud. So what does diversity education look like in your department? What underrepresented groups are most supported? By that I mean, what underrepresented groups have the most programs, resources, representation within the department? What underrepresented groups are least supported? What issues are currently being talked about at your campus? What's the campus climate, campus buzz? What are the quote unquote hot topics you're hearing about? Has there been student activism on campus? Has it been passive or active? And has it occurred within or outside the residential community? So I'm just going to give everyone 1 minute to take a time to reflect on these. All right, we're going to go ahead and continue on. Those pauses I know feel so long, but I'm hoping that gave you some good time to start thinking about these questions. If you weren't able to answer all of them, that's okay, but just some things to keep on your mind. One thing I like to talk about is the role that colleges have in activism. The majority of movements in the United States began at college campuses. Recently, one of our congressmen, John Lewis, passed away, and he was a founding member of SNCC, which was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a very prominent member of the 1960s civil rights movement, and he was in university at the time. And so I think that we really do a disservice when we don't bring up issues of activism and talk with our students in college about the role, because realistically, colleges have been part of pretty much every large social justice movement in some way or another. And so it's really pays tribute to our historical work as college institutions by encouraging these environments and really pushing our students to consider being part of different activist collectives. Next slide, please. So one thing I wanted to talk about was kind of the framework I'm using to present this topic. So in my role as a diversity educator, I really like to focus on these three spaces: action, affinity, and education spaces. Now, oftentimes when I look at an organization, I'll notice that education happens the majority of the time. So let's say 85% of the time, the work with diversity going on is education. And by that, I mean we're doing like Identity 101 trainings, right? We're doing things like Safe Zone. We're doing things like educational theory. We're educating on supporting undocumented students, supporting our students of color. All these things are great and should definitely be happening. But I notice that that is the majority of what we do, is just educating on topics and educating theories and best practices. The thing I see second most happen is affinity space. And these spaces, I'm going to go into more detail about what those are, but these are spaces meant solely for folks of a shared targeted experience. So this might be a veteran center, a disability center, LGBTQ center, spaces for students of color. And so these spaces, I would say, take up about 10%, maybe even closer to some departments, like 10 to 15% of what the focus is on. And then that leaves action spaces, right? So if we've done the pyramid math a bit, you've seen I've gone from 85, adding 10 to that. And so if we see action spaces occurring or education around that, it's either like 5%, just a bit, or none at all. And so action spaces, again, is that what we consider activism and educating around that and having students participate in different activist causes regarding diversity. And so I often see a pyramid model, but what I think is more effective is kind of a pie model like this, where everything gets its own time. So ideally, as you do diversity education work in your departments, you should see more students wanting to create spaces for students to feel safe, which is great. You should also see students wanting to do more action. So engaging in more changes that really address systemic oppression and the systemic nature of issues that permeate and cause tensions and injustice, right, in different systems. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to define these a little bit more about what these spaces looks like. So first of all, I want to talk a bit about affinity spaces. And so affinity spaces really are focused on a shared experience. So this is bringing folks together who have a shared, targeted, or marginalized experience. It's a way to provide support, and it's a way for people to connect and build a really strong community. One example at my institution we have women of color group and men of color groups. And so these groups get together and they meet once a month, and it's for students, faculty, and staff who have that shared identity. And so we create a variety of programs. It's mostly just us grabbing a meal and chatting together about our experience, being guided by questions. But we've done other really great things, like networking events have come out of that, where we speak with community members. We've done art projects. We've done book clubs. And so we've done a lot of different activities within these spaces. But what's nice about them is when you have group students and faculty and staff get together with a shared common experience, there's not this explaining that has to go on. There's this kind of understanding of a shared identity, and that creates a really great space for our students to develop. It's often considered a safer space, if not a safe space for students. And I've seen other examples of this. I've seen disability spaces where students with disabilities come together. Veteran centers are a really good example of an affinity space as well. So resources and energy is focused on one specific group. So that is what affinity spaces are. Education spaces, these differ from that, right? They focus on theory. They may include some experience-based learning, but realistically, it's focused on theories, models, different best practices. It's meant to provide information and practices to all interested learners. So your learners might be people who have age identities or target identities, right? There's folks who are on various ends of the spectrum. So people who are completely new to diversity work, maybe wanting to engage in this, and people who are quite advanced. So education spaces are meant to be open to a wide variety of learners at a wide variety of levels. right? And they're considered to be facilitated by folks with expertise. This could be formal or informal expertise. So folks who perhaps have some formal education, who have decided to take on and educate on this topic, maybe folks who have experience, or maybe folks who have just been working with diversity education for so long that they have gathered a lot of information they'd like to share out. And education spaces often have parameters to be a safer space. So we consider these like our rules of engagement, our respect guidelines, different things like that are brought into education spaces. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then the last space, and what I'm focusing on today, are our action spaces. And so action spaces differ from these two spaces because they're focused on change with a tangible outcome. So it does likely include an education piece. When I get to the King philosophy model later, a big part of that model is education both inward and outward. So education is definitely a part of action spaces. But realistically, these spaces are focused on creating change. They're bringing folks together with a shared common goal and figuring out how they can achieve that goal. Right? The result of these action spaces is change which benefits folks with targeted identities. So one really great example that I have in my local area, I currently live in the Olympia region of Washington State, and we have a group called Standing Up for Racial Justice. It's called SURGE. And so this I would consider an action space because it's a lot of folks who identify as white and then also people of color as well. And so this group works together to really do some education and learn about systems of oppression, how they impact and permeate racial injustices. But then they come together after that learning and do lobbying for legislators. They'll do rallies, protest, all sorts of things. Really, their goal is to change the system. Okay. Action spaces can also be passive or active. And I'll get a little bit more into what that looks like in another slide. And when I talk about different types of activism, what that may look like. And they also may be individual or continuous programs. So it might be one rally, one event, right? One large sit-in. That might be the action space. Or it could be continuous ongoing programming. For example, St. Martin's University is a religious institution, and so we have the Catholic Relief Services. Every year, the students have a focus on something they would like to help address. This year, it's malnourishment and for children ages 5 and under, and so they're going to be doing a lot of continuous ongoing programming this year to educate the community with the goal of resulting in change. Action spaces can be led by folks with target or agent identities. And also, action spaces are not a safe space. So this is the biggest thing I like to emphasize to students. I think when we engage in diversity work, we want to make sure we're ensuring certain guidelines, right? Respect guidelines are making sure people feel safe to engage and participate and to learn. And we want to make sure we're honoring and not having a negative impact on folks with marginalized or targeted identities. But action spaces, unfortunately, are not a safe space, right? You're putting your message out there, and you will get pushback from folks, and that pushback can be either positive, constructive conversation, or it could not be, right? And so there's different levels that non-respectful conversation can go. And so it's really important for students to be prepared for that and to know that you're entering a space where you may not get some positive things back at you, and how do you deal with that, or how can we help to support you in that? Next slide, please. Great. So activism in the university context. So this is my big disclaimer slide. And what I mean by that is there's a couple of things that you personally as a professional should do before engaging in education around activism or in activism in general at your university. So this is not me saying don't participate in activism at all, but rather me saying make sure that as a professional, we're kind of changing our gears and realizing that we might be wearing our personal identities hats, but we're also wearing an administrator hat to some extent. And so we want to make sure that we're considering these things before we participate. So one thing I recommend is to be familiar with your university policy. Most university policies have some type of guidelines regarding activism, regarding protest specifically, because that's what we most often think about, I think, when we think about activism. And so make sure you're familiar with what your university policy and what that looks like. Make sure you're also familiar with your city, state, province ordinances, so what those look like and how they impact your university. And then understand what issues are most affecting students. So what might you expect? What is quote unquote the hot topic around campus, or what's most rising to the surface? Those are really important things to consider as you engage in education, because if you're preparing a presentation around this or a space around this for students, it's really great to know kind of what might already be on their mind so you can best provide resources to them. And then before participating in activism, make sure you speak with your supervisor about what that might look like. I know some universities have contracts that stipulate that that different types of activism aren't permitted, making sure you're speaking with your human resources department, right? And make sure you're following best practices. Now, when I say this, doing this work is really actually a step of the King philosophy that we're going to talk about later. And this is the personal commitment stage, where you're really thinking about kind of what capacity do I have to engage with activism and what might that look like. So if folks have other questions, feel free to ask those at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So the thing I love about action spaces and activism is there's absolutely so many ways students can be involved and engage with this. So I've divided this up into two groups, one being a more passive or individual type of action, and one being more active and group type of interaction. So education, I think, is probably the biggest and most important way we can engage in activism. Just being educated around topics and sharing that information is huge. And there's so many ways we see our students do this, right? Flyers with information, posters, tabling, social media, all those things are really big in just getting the information out and educating around topics. Folks signing petitions, creating awareness campaigns around campus, climate surveys and issue-based surveys. So I think climate surveys can be really instrumental in understanding your university culture and understanding kind of what changes are on the horizon or need to be thought about. Right. When we do a climate survey, we look at different identity groups. We look at what issues are facing students. We look at different areas that we notice are problematic, right, and are, for lack of a better word, oppressing students. And so how do we address those, right, and how do we engage students in those conversations? So climate surveys are a passive type of activism, but they can produce some really great change. Fundraising for different organizations and events, and letter writing campaigns. So again, these are all types of activism work that are individually based, a bit more passive in nature, but definitely can have an active component. The other side of the screen, you'll see our active/group type of activism. So you'll see education again here. And by this, we mean things more like teach-ins, active programming, and peer-to-peer programs. So we might see our RAs do this or other student groups do this on campus, where they learn about something and they want to teach folks about it. So they host a program, an event, might in this case, in our current climate, do a Zoom about what's going on. And so these types of programs are that more active education piece. Contacting local government officials to create change. That's another way to go about it. Getting involved with hall councils and student government, right? Community service, and then protests, rallies, and sit-ins are also things that we see when we're looking at active group activism. Now, all I'll say about this is I always like to clarify for students what those last three things mean. So what is the difference between a protest, a rally, and a sit-in? Because in my time as an educator, I see students kind of think of them all as one thing, and there's not really a delineation between those. But there is one, and it's really important. Protests are meant to be against something, right? So you're protesting against something happening. Rallies are in support of something, right? And sit-ins are when we're taking up and occupying space. And so I've just broken these three very complex things down to very simple terms. So I would really encourage folks to do a little bit more research on that, but that's kind of a way to break those down for students so they can start to think about how they might want to go down which avenue for the issue that they're working on. Next slide, please. Cool. So one model I want to bring up, I'm just doing a quick overview again, so this is not an in-depth exploration, is the MAP model for organizing social movements. So I really enjoyed this model for a couple of reasons. One is because it talks about 4 different roles that folks take on in social activism. So this model doesn't say one particular role is better or worse than another, which I think is great. It's talking about how all 4 are needed and happen at different times. And I think students will often take on different roles depending on the issue, depending on their positionality. So basically where they're situated, their space, time, and place, and kind of what's called for. And so oftentimes I think when we think of activism or when we see it portrayed in the media, it's often the rebel identity that we see the most, right? But all of these identities are needed and important. So I just wanted to provide a very brief bird's eye picture of what these 4 different roles students could take on might look like. So citizen is a more values-oriented role. And so this focuses on the positivity and promoting values that are largely agreed upon in society. So this is what we would think about as an active citizen, someone who promotes change that folks can mostly agree on. And they're really the kind of the sounding board, and they're kind of the voice for their community and what issues are most salient. They really do promote more positive, widely held values. So that's what the citizen role might look like. Think of it as a really engaged citizen. When we get to the rebel, again, this is the role I think we most often associate with activism. We're looking at someone who's like protesting social conditions and putting things in the public spotlight. So saying no to violations of our values, right? And so current protests on racial injustice are great examples of the rebel role. I don't know how many folks are following basketball, but the NBA and WNBA are really taking on that rebel identity, which is great. They're putting racial issues to the forefront, and they're really making it in the public eye, and saying that this behavior is just unacceptable, right? And so that is an example of what that rebel identity might look like for our students. It also can be very strategic, right? So choosing when to engage with that and when to put things in the spotlight. Another identity we have here is our change agents. And so those are folks who are focused on positive and constructive solutions. So the change agents are really great because what they do is they listen, right? They do a lot of listening to folks who are facing that oppression, right? And making sure their voices are heard and bringing those ideas really to the top. It's a lot of grassroots organizing. So really seeing who is affected by an issue and making sure they have a part and a piece in the conversation. They also work to educate larger communities. So change agents are really focused on that long-term work. When I think about diversity education, I think we often want it to be a sprint, but it is a marathon, right? So it's long and ongoing change. And so change agents are really focusing on that marathon piece. They're not really focusing, they can focus on one singular issue, but they're focusing on the larger systemic issue. So change agents most often are looking at oppression as it exists within a system and thinking about how can we shift that system to no longer be oppressive. So they're the folks thinking long term. Right. And then we have reformers. And these folks, I think, are often overlooked. And this identity is really people who work within structures and systems within society to create change. So these might be our students who are passionate about running for hall government, passionate about running for student council, right? They want to get in a position that's part of the system, right? And then use those official channels, use their work within that system to make change. And so, an example, actually, so like if you've ever heard of an ombudsman, so a government official who basically goes through and they're a person that folks can submit a formal complaint to, and then that person follows up on the complaint and makes recommendations to legislators about how to change laws in order to address that complaint and concern. So these four roles of social activism, I've just painted again, bird's eye picture of what these are. I have included a link to a summary of this model in the reference and resources section because it talks about how these identities can be effective and ineffective. So it's important to understand that side as well. But what I focused on is the effectiveness of these different four roles that students might take on. Next slide, please. Great. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the King philosophy. And so this philosophy focuses on the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was a integral part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the United States. And so his teachings focused on the idea of nonviolence. And so the reason I bring up this model is because I often find with students when we're starting to talk about activism, it's important to give folks a framework to look on. There's not really a lot of formal education around activism or around action spaces that occurs in the higher education community that I have seen, at least in the institutions I've worked at. And I think that again, does a disservice to our students. And so how they learn about activism is either through experience, which is great, or they learn about kind of from what they see just around. And so I think by providing them with a framework like this one or another framework that maybe meets the needs of your institution in terms of your institution's values can be really great. The King philosophy, I think, really was harmonious with our Benedictine values at St. Martin's University because it focuses on nonviolence and it focuses on the idea of kind of a whole community living and respect for persons, which are some of our values. And so the King philosophy outlines these 6 values about nonviolence, how it's a way of life for courageous people, how it seeks to win friendship and understanding, how it seeks to defeat injustice and not people, how it holds that suffering can educate and transform, it chooses love instead of hate, and believes the universe is on the side of justice. And so one thing that really comes through with this philosophy is the idea that advocacy and action work really should focus on issues, right? So we want to take a look at what issues face us and how we bring all community members around from all sides to work on this issue. And so in that way, the small, again, is very like long-term focused, very marathon style focused, right? Because individual injustices can happen and we can take action and have consequences happen if there's individual action. So just an example, at our campus, we had a racist image that was shared around by a student. Action was taken against that student for sharing that image. But then our university also needs to have a conversation about why students feel like comfortable sharing these images, right? So there's more of an underlying issue that we want to address. And so that is an example of like how, yes, there is an individual, but we want to work also on the injustice, which is the racism, right? And not necessarily focus all of our attention on the person. The other thing that's I think this philosophy speaks to is the need for community and understanding, right? So how we encourage our students to understand the issue holistically, and how we encourage them to engage in conversation with folks who they might have a different perspective from. And so again, that winning friendship and understanding is really a way to encourage students to have dialogue with others and to really look at social issues as a spectrum as opposed to a dichotomy. So not necessarily an us versus them, but how are people on different ends of the spectrum or different parts of the spectrum of thinking, and how do we find commonality or shared ground? And when we can't, how do we engage in that conversation and really share our values? Next slide, please. Great. And so the other thing I wanted to talk about with the King philosophy, in addition to those grounding principles that were on the previous slide, these are the 6 steps. So the 6 steps that a student could follow if they wanted to work with nonviolent social change. So if they want to engage in action, this is a philosophy they could take on and a way that they could perform that. So the first is information gathering, and the second is education. So these two go a bit hand in hand. When we look at information gathering, that's more of the inward piece. So if I want to learn about a topic and be an advocate for change around that, the first thing you need to do is gather information from all sides of the spectrum. So what are different perspectives on this issue? Why is this issue a point of conflict? Why has change not happened yet? Are all great questions for a student to ask as they gather information. Then once they have the information gathered, the second step will be to share that information outward. So again, going back to that slide where I talked about types of advocacy and types of activism, when we're looking at passive programming, or we're looking at active programming with teach-ins and sit-ins, things like that, that is where education can become more outward. The third thing we want to talk about is personal commitment. So making sure students understand what their commitment level is to something. I'll share a personal example about personal commitment. So a couple years ago, the school I was an alumna from, was having a sit-in to create change around our education curriculum, being more inclusive and including more underrepresented voices, because it was very much a Eurocentric teaching curriculum that the department had. And so what they were doing is they wanted to reach out to alum who identified as folks of color to get their input and to basically sign letters to the college administration advocating for more inclusive curriculum, which is a great idea in theory. But when I attended the program across 4 cohorts, so from freshman to senior when I entered, I was the only Black identified person within that entire program. And then as I progressed through the program, I was one of maybe, I want to say 5 or 6 folks of color who were participating in the program. So within that 8-year span, there weren't a lot of alumni who were folks of color, right? So that was, my personal commitment level was pretty low for that particular idea because they wanted these letters to be anonymous. Well, with that few students, you could probably surmise where they were coming from. And so I had a conversation with them, and I assisted them in different ways, right, through some of this education actually for those students as opposed to that. So really personal commitment is about finding out kind of what you can do, what maybe is pushing against your boundary and that you're not able to do, and working within those parameters. The 4th step, discussion negotiation, is really meeting with folks who are in power or have the power to make that change and talking about how they can make that change happen. So can we work together to accomplish this goal, right, to decrease the injustice going on? Discussion negotiation should take up a good bulk of the social change that's happening. And then if discussion negotiation fails, then moving to direct action. So that's where you see more of those things like protests, rallies, and sit-in is that direct action piece. And then after that happens, you want to make sure that your community is coming back together and going through a reconciliation process. So basically debriefing, understanding what happened and understanding how the community may move forward. So in this way, you can see the King philosophy with the steps here really does dovetail with the founding principles. And something I'd like to mention about these steps is they're not necessarily, they do go in order, but you might cycle back to them. So consider them more like phases. So you might, for example, go through steps 1, 2, 3, and then get to 4, discussion negotiation, and you may have something that resolves from that. And your students might think, okay, great, this is resolved. But then after the resolution, they might find more things coming up that they need to re-educate themselves on and might want to go through that process again. So it's really important to think of these as phases students move through, as opposed to like steps. They might go in different orders, and that's okay. Next slide, please. So one thing I wanted to make sure I ended on and share was a couple takeaways before we go into questions. So some things I want to make sure that we're considering as we're helping students navigate action spaces. We want to make sure we're doing 4 things. So these are my 4 big takeaways from this presentation. First, make sure that you're providing educational opportunities for students to understand issues. So if there are issues that are going on your campus, don't shy away from them. I think that's something that they can be challenging conversations to have, right? And they're not going to be conversations where at the end everyone's on the same page, but that's okay, because it's really important to have the conversation. For example, on our campus, we were having a conversation around, we are already trained about what to do if you have residents who are across the doors from each other. One has a Blue Lives Matter flag, one has a Black Lives Matter sign. How do you engage in that conversation? And students just didn't know what to do, right? And so engaging in that conversation, it didn't bring up anything that wasn't already on their minds, but what it did was it provided them tools for how they might address that. So again, 1, providing educational opportunities for students to understand issues is really important. The second thing we want to do is we want to provide opportunities for students to learn about action spaces and activism. So doing presentations like this, presenting different models, I just scratched the surface on this, right? I gave y'all a couple different things that we could think about, but realistically, there's hundreds of activism models that folks can use. So really do some of your own exploring, and use this as just a jumping off point. And so giving students the opportunity to learn about action activism, learning about history, learning about the role colleges have played in activism movements, I think is really huge and important for diversity work. Third, you want to make sure help other students understand the risks that can come with activism, right? So engaging in action spaces can be risky. And so it's really important they understand that risk and that they're prepared to be resilient. They're prepared to engage in that space in a meaningful way. But what I've also found is with that risk comes great reward. Students who participate in action spaces, who participate in activism, I find have really significant growth. It's kind of experiential learning to the max, right? They really find their passion, they might find their stride, and they really might make meaningful, impactful change, which is the ultimate goal, and that's really cool. And then the fourth and final thing I want to say is make sure you're introducing students to different ways of embracing an activist identity. Like I said earlier, oftentimes we associate activism with that rebel identity, and that's great. And there's so many other ways students can really value and engage in that role. And so they might be actually participating in action, participating in activism, but might not be able to name it yet. So being able to introduce them to different ways of thinking around that can help them really embrace the work that they're doing. So that is my brief overview of different ways we can support students as they engage in activism work and how we can have a foundational conversation with them. So at this point, I'm going to take a pause for my presentation, and I want to open the floor to any questions that folks have.
So that is the end of the presentation there, and it looks like Janie has been able to join us. Thank you for joining us, Janie.
Of course. Good morning, everyone.
Yeah. So are there any questions at this time?
And while folks might be formulating questions, I just wanted to note that I did include in the chat box the resources that I used for my presentation. So in resources include like the link to the MAP model or a breakdown of that model that folks can take a look at, and that was the 4 roles of social activism, a few links for resources regarding the King philosophy and where it came from, which was the letter from Birmingham jail, and then a few other resources just around like steps, types of activism students can engage in.
I have a question for you, Janie.
Oh, sure.
It's hi everyone. It's Bob Lambert from Mount Royal University and president of NWACUHO. I'm wondering how you balance patience, understanding, and kindness with also, I think, times where we need to be firm, assertive, and I guess I don't know. Hard on some students when they're not quite being open to being educated.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I can give an example we just had. So I'll go with the Black Lives, Blue Lives Matter flag example. So that was something that came from our residence hall. And we, one of my colleagues actually is on the call as well, so she can attest to it. It was a very tenuous situation. One of the things that was really interesting is we got a letter from our Saints Alumni Action Network, who had found out about this Blue Lives Matter flag being displayed in the window. And we had to email them, or I had to email back. I had to kind of balance my own perspective also as a professional of color, because they emailed the letter directly to me whilst I was on maternity leave. And they also explained to me, a Black identified person, how police brutalize Black people and oppress Black people. And I was just like, okay, there's one layer there where I was professional and having to put on my professional hat and kind of like put aside my identity hat. But on the other side, it's like I did want to respond to their concerns. So we drafted an email, responded to that concern, and then responded to our resident who was hanging the flag, and had a conversation around kind of the impact of that flag and what that means. And ultimately, because within our policy or any school policy, we can't limit speech, and the Blue Lives Matter flag is not categorized as hate speech, we weren't able to really do anything other than have the conversation. The student kind of took it down, but it's kind of interesting what they ended up doing, but they put it kind of in another place where it was permitted. And so what we decided to do was to have a further conversation with our public safety offices where the student worked, and they're going to have an educational conversation with our whole staff around being kind of an inclusive, welcoming environment, and kind of what displaying certain things can mean to our communities of color, and how, if you're displaying these things prominently in the halls where you live, how people are not as likely to come to you for emergency, which is what you're there for. So they're going to have that conversation with the student. And so that's one example of how I've had that conversation. Another example is when we had students who are really pushing against policy, but and wanting that change, but kind of that diversity is a marathon, not a sprint time on, really having to talk with student groups about like, okay, you've done your thing and you're welcome to continue protesting or doing action, and just know like the result is this is where we're at for this year. And this does include things like policy changes or different things that just need to make it to like August when we enact our new policy to implement. We just can't do some things mid-year based on our process. And so we've had those conversations with students as well, just to say like your points are really good, and you can continue educating around that. And you can protest if you'd like, because that's your right. But there's a limit to what we can do as an institution just based on the time period or just based on different things. And in my experience, those conversations have gone well because we have taken the time to lay out a plan for the students. They understand what is going to happen. And so they're able to respond to not having that instant action. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Oh, of course. And then for folks on the call, I'm curious if anyone has seen an increase in student activism on their campuses. If you want to type to the chat, I'm just kind of curious for folks who are here if we are generally seeing an increase or if it's just something we're anticipating. I know at our institution, we are definitely seeing an increase in it. That's quite high over this past summer. Oh yeah, some increase. Yeah, and we're seeing an increase, I think, in both the United States and in Canada as well. I do also want to note that my resources are largely based from U.S. sources. I did do some research into Canadian resources, and I didn't find anything I was super comfortable putting out there, but I would like to say that Canada's Amnesty International probably has the best resources if you're looking for something like that. But Chris and I were actually chatting while we were doing this presentation. He mentioned as well that Canadian resources are not as easy to come by regarding activism, but something out there. Great. Are there any other questions I can answer for folks?
I just have the answer to that last question. So
Sure.
Johan. Let me put my camera on. Okay, so I'm Johan. I'm a resident director at Western Oregon University, and I also advise the Black Student Union. And this spring, we had really summer as a star of summer started. They, with me, crafted a letter, an open letter from BSU to the faculty and staff on campus, but then we got a lot of responses, so we're like, let's just expand it out, and then it applies to students as well. And it really was a statement of like, we need the university to do better. And from there's been a lot of like movement starting from different departments and things, some that have been interesting missteps. So we had some people from one department contact us or not really directly contact us and say, we're starting a fundraiser for the Black Student Union Scholarship, but there isn't a Black Student Union Scholarship. So they had contacted our foundation, started be like, oh, we want to make this fund, so we want to donate to that, without getting any permission or asking us or any contact from us. So it was just like, thank you for doing that work. We want that money, but like, you didn't ask us what we needed or what we wanted, or now I have to do all this back end stuff to get the scholarship going when we weren't planning to do that in the first place. So we're like, okay. So it's been interesting. We are a quarter system, so the students aren't back yet. And we are going to be 95% online. So we're going to have the halls open, but we don't have classes mostly in person. So it's going to be interesting as we get students back on campus that want to be in activism spaces, but with COVID-19 and navigating those things and doing lots of education. So I'm the one in charge of our fall training presentation about student diversity, activism, everything. So it's been exciting getting it together. And when I saw this is the topic for today, I was like, yes. So very excited. Thank you for sharing.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you. And you touched on a lot of great points in there. One thing I wanted to highlight is just the importance of making sure students are, if they want to advocate for a group, they're including voices of those who are experiencing that oppression in that. And I mentioned that in the presentation, but that's your example is perfect. Or like exactly why it's like, well, if we had reached out to the Black Student Union and, you know, been in collaborative, then you could have done something that was a little bit more holistic. But when people in points of privilege make assumptions and then, you know, give folks things, it's like, well, that's exactly what privilege is, right? It's like you assuming what a population needs and then kind of acting on that. And then that doesn't really provide support to the community. And then with activism presentations, I think that those are really great. I'm so excited to hear that you all are doing that. I think there's a lot of really great online activism, and what I'd recommend is having students or researching a bit how Oregon's legislative system is set up, because they'll need to be doing things online for legislation. And what that does is that's going to create more opportunities for students to engage with their legislators because they won't need to travel to the Capitol for those sessions, but rather could participate online. So that might be a great avenue to take a look at, just a suggestion. But thank you so much for your question and sharing that example.
Thank you.
And then we have a question from Holly. Do you have any tips for supporting students who are frustrated while engaging in the discussion negotiation phase with parties above your position? It says they tapped out you and your resources as internal professionals. Oh, that's a really good question. I think just what I like to do, and that's really hard, right? So I don't have like a perfect answer for that, but I'll say what I do in my best practice is I just kind of let them know what I can do. So it's like, if they're going to work with me, like, here's what you can do. Here's what I am able to do for you. And for me, a lot of it is like, I'm not the person who's going to be able to change policies, but what I can do is I can help you come up with a campaign or come up with the wording or really help you kind of nuance what you're trying to say and get you that meaning. So that's what I can do. And so I would, you know, acknowledge their frustrations and say like, yeah, this is part of the work. And really naming that, you know, discussions and negotiations, it's unfortunately not just like an easy peasy done situation where you bring up the problem and then there's a solution. The systems we work in are complex, and that's kind of why systemic oppression is this big thing that hasn't been solved and isn't quite solvable yet, because there's so many processes with that. So I think educating students on that, what systemic oppression is, and kind of, you know, explaining that colleges are a giant system, right? So we have to navigate all these policies, we have to navigate up, and if you want to go the discussion negotiation route, it's going to take time. So kind of acknowledging their frustrations, explain as best you can of what's going on. And also, if you feel that the stopping points are reasonable, like naming that as well. And so if they're really frustrated, something's taking a while to get back to them, like it's been 2 days and they haven't gotten a response yet, you might explain like, you know, the cabinet needs to meet to discuss these things. You know, they meet on a weekly basis. For this, they may have been meeting more frequently, and just let them know like, yeah, it's going to take time and it's absolutely frustrating because we want the change to happen. But that is, you know, kind of part of the process. So I guess to summarize what I just said was to want to explain kind of what the boundaries are of your position and what you can do for them, direct them to folks who might be able to assist you further, to assist them further in their negotiation and make that introduction, and then also explain to them the university processes that exist and kind of what's a reasonable timeline or what might be a point of concern for them. I hope that makes sense. Does that answer your question? Oh, great. Perfect. Thank you. And I have a question from Zach. Oh, sorry. I have a question from Heather. Oh, great. So thank you, Chris, for putting in a new link for that.
Yeah, I was just missing the end. Sorry, go
great.
on.
No worries. And then Zach has a question: when establishing affinity spaces, is it typically best practice to exclude or include allies who are not part of the target identity, or what situations might it make sense to include or not include allies? That's a really great question. For affinity spaces, it is best practice to really focus on that target identity. So only have folks of target identity set up and participate in the space. What might happen is, for example, with the women and men of color group, that I established the women of color group first, and then there was interest in the men of color group. So I found a person who had the identity of being a man of color to organize that space, but I coordinated the things all around. So I guess it wasn't really agency, right? Because men are not, I'm not the agent as a woman, but in the case for that affinity group, what I did was I scheduled the space behind the scenes, right? Made sure the lunch order got in for that group, and that was the limit of my role. I didn't come to the group, I didn't participate in it. I just kind of set behind the scenes things. So if you have an ally who's interested, or perhaps your university population among staff faculty is quite homogenous, so a student comes to you wanting to do an affinity space, and they pick you because you're an ally, and you can't find another staff or faculty member who identifies with that identity. What you might do is help coordinate the back end part of that, but leave the space creation and presence in the space specifically to the target group. In terms of including allies, those tend to be more actually action spaces rather than affinity spaces. So an example I'm thinking of is a group called SURGE. I'll put the acronym in, and it stands for Standing Up for Racial Justice. And this group is made predominantly of allies. And so that is an example of a group that what they do is they educate around topics of racial injustice, and they organize, but they also bring in the voices of folks who are of those marginalized identities, and they really lead the discussion part of it and really lead the action of like what needs to be done in the community. And then SURGE, which is made up of allies, does the organizing. So instead of being the one speaking at the protest and leading the protest, they'll maybe in the background providing childcare or different things like that. So if an ally is involved in creating an affinity space of some type, or helping with an action space, they're really elevating the voices of those who are marginalized and taking a background role. Does that answer your question, Zach? Cool. Yeah, no worries. That's an excellent question. And, I understand the reality is like, these are all best practices. And the reality is sometimes you get tapped for something and you're not of that identity. For example, I'm the advisor to the Pacific Islander group, where I have been for a couple of years. And then they found a Pacific Islander faculty staff member that got hired recently. And so I graciously bowed out of that position and was like, go for it, like take it on. So, but, I was happy to, help them out as best I could. And I really named for them when they asked me to do it. I was like, I am not of this identity at all, but I'm happy to do X, Y, and Z for you, but this is what I can't do. And they were happy to have me advise them until they were able to find someone who was of that background who could advise them, which was super great. Yeah. Awesome. Great. If there's any other questions, you're welcome to email me. You can email me. I'll give you a couple emails. I am on like an intermittent maternity leave, so you're going to get an out of office. But if you email me, I will be happy to respond to any questions that you have, or as things come up. And I also just want to, like, before we head out, just want to underscore the importance of that personal commitment piece. So really understand your role within the institution, and what you are able to do and what you might not be able to do within your position. And that's okay. My advocacy within my institution looks very different from my advocacy outside, just me as my own personal being. But I do recognize as staff members of a university, we sometimes have to put on our administrator hat and really balance what those roles look like. So this work is messy sometimes, and that's okay. But if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to be a resource as best I can.
I want to thank you so much, Janie, for making the time for this presentation, to record it earlier this week and to join us right now. I know that I took a lot away from it. Both times listening through, I took different things, and so I just really appreciate that, and I hope everyone took that information as well. So thank you so much again, and thank you to all of you who joined us today. We will have another First Friday webinar coming up at the beginning of October. I'm blanking on the date right now, but we'll send out some information about that later on this month. Don't forget to fill out the feedback form, which I have added into the chat there. And if you are interested in doing your own First Friday webinar, we are always open and looking for new presenters. So please feel free to email me and Becca, who's the other co-chair, at prodev@northwestcuho.org. But Thank you again, Janie, so much for this presentation, and thank you all for joining us, and have a great weekend.
Have a great weekend, everyone.